So welcome to all of you to the BISA IPEG Book Prize Lecture, and this is an annual event in which we ask the most recent recipient of the IPEG Book Prize to speak to us. And today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Kate Bedford at the University of Birmingham, whose 2019 book, Bingo Capitalism, The Law and Political Economy of Everyday Gambling, was the recipient of the 2020 prize. As our book prize panel noted, Professor Bedford's book is strikingly original in almost every respect. It is also a real page turner and a breath of fresh air, in sum, an instant classic and entirely worthy of this year's prize. The IPEG Book Prize Committee for 2020 was made up of Matthew Bishop, Akosu Adakwa, Andrew Gamble, Adrian Roberts, Lisa Tilley, who's here with us today, and Ernesto Vivares. And we thank them all for the time they spent undertaking the work of shortlisting for and judging the book prize. We'd also like to thank the Review of International Political Economy for the sponsorship of this event today. This is the second time that IPEG have run the book prize as an online event, and we will be following the same format that we used last year when we celebrated the award of the 2019 prize to Adam Hanier. Specifically, the book prize will be introduced by one of the members of the IPEG Book Prize Committee, in this case, Dr. Lisa Tilley. Professor Bedford will then speak for around about 20 minutes about the book, and then we'll be handing over to Professor Donatella Alessandrini, who'll provide some reflections on Professor Bedford's book, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A. So I'll just basically ask people to raise their hands. So let me quickly introduce the speakers to you before I hand over. Kate Bedford is Professor of Law at the University of Birmingham. She's an interdisciplinary scholar with a background in political economy, development, socio-legal studies, and studies of gender and sexuality. Her previous work includes the book Developing Partnerships, Gender, Sexuality, and the Reformed World Bank, which explored the World Bank's gender and development lending in Latin America. Lisa Tilley is a lecturer in the Department of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Her research draws on various theoretical approaches to the colonial question in material analyses of accumulation and expropriation, with a special focus on frontiers of capital in Indonesia. Finally, Professor Donatella Alessandrini is Professor of Law at the University of Kent. Her research lies at the intersection of law and political economy, with a particular interest in development studies, critical trade and development literature, feminist political economy, and political theory. So without further ado, I'd like to turn now to Lisa Tilley as a representative of the prize committee to introduce Kate Bedford's book. Lisa, over to you.
Thanks, Juanita, and thanks to everyone else for coming. It's good to see some friendly names here, even if I can't see your faces. And very warm congratulations to Kate. It's really great to have this opportunity to congratulate you over Zoom. I'll just say a couple of words about how the prize works, and then try to convey a bit of a collective assessment of the winning text. So, as Juanita said, we have a committee which is really brilliantly shepherded by Matt Bishop, and our meetings are actually coordinated across 3 different continents, which is great. It's kind of serious business, but it's also really enjoyable. And in the 2020 shortlist, alongside Bingo Capitalism, we read books by Ilyas Alami, Peter Newell, Amin Saman, Owen Worth, and Sophie Thornhill. So it was a really excellent selection of works representing the diversity of scholarship which is going on in IPE at the moment. And just credit to all the shortlisted authors, because all of their works are brilliant in their own way. But still, we all agree that Bingo Capitalism should take the prize for a number of reasons. I was going to make a joke about there being a full house of reasons, but I won't go there. So first of all, really just the sheer quality of the research really set it apart as an incredibly well-evidenced text. I mean, Kate's substantial ethnographic work This has been collated over the course of many years of hanging around in bingo halls, and it makes for a very detailed and intimate read, which is just a joy to read. And this ethnographic work is also complemented by analysis of other sources, including parliamentary records relating to the regulation of bingo, stretching back to the turn of the 20th century. Excuse me. The book also really illuminates spaces which are rarely approached as sites of interesting social and economic dynamics. So bingo halls might loom large really in our urban landscapes. We often pass them every day, but those outside of bingo communities rarely take a moment to think about how these function as centres of social and economic life. And to put it quite bluntly, you know, what working class women do for fun has long been as invisible as their labour, especially in comparison with more kind of the high society exploits and activities. But Kate's own connections with working class bingo playing communities mean this is a book which is written with a sense of fondness, I think, for the participants and players involved, rather than one that's marked by the usual kind of distance and separation between the researcher and the researched. So opening up what's otherwise a bit of a black box in our social fabric, Kate's really rich analysis reveals a lot about these everyday spaces of play within capitalist society, but it also says a lot about how this is reflected back. And so in other words, what bingo itself says about capitalism as a whole. And it works on at least two levels. So firstly, by fleshing out what the dynamics within the bingo hall tell us about regulatory regimes. And secondly, by revealing the somewhat counterintuitive relations of mutual aid, some unexpected relations of mutual aid within bingo communities themselves. And I'll just quote from our original write-up. We said bingo capitalism really brings to life the power structures underpinning the bingo hall, from regulatory neglect in the early 20th century to rapid technological change underpinning new patterns of accumulation today. Alongside the people who inhabit and navigate those forces, often with a spirit of mutual aid that's barely captured in our existing understandings of either gambling or the economy more broadly. So as Juanita said, we described bingo capitalism as an instant classic, and we totally stand by that. There's really been nothing like this book really written before or since. So again, just very warm congratulations and well done, Kate. It's a pleasure to hand this prize over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was a great introduction. Now hand over to Kate.
Can you hear me okay? Thanks so much, Lisa. That's just so lovely. And I just wanted to say such a huge thank you to the BISA IPEG committee for the prize and all the work that goes into prizes like this, all of that social reproduction labor that goes into sustaining disciplines. Thank you so much for that labor. I'd like to thank this kind soul who I think nominated the book, but I can't name them in case I get it wrong. And thanks also to obviously Juanita and Lisa and Donatella and everybody who's making time to have this conversation today. So the book was actually quite a long time in coming. The research for it started in 2008, but when it was finally published in late 2019, I think it's fair to say that it got a bit taken over by events. So when I heard about the IPEG prize, I actually didn't believe it because I was pretty sure that no one had read the book. So even without us being in the midst of extended industrial action and then a global pandemic, I figured that bingo was probably a bit niche to be taken seriously. So bingo's a lottery style game, random number game that's especially popular in many parts of the world with working class women. In many settler colonial societies, including Canada and the US, it's also disproportionately popular with Indigenous populations. And the game spread globally through military and missionary circuits. And so in the book, I talk about it being globally significant. But it's fair to say, I think, that it hasn't really been taken seriously in academia, and it certainly hasn't been taken seriously in law and political economy. In fact, the first chapter of the book recounts all the reasons that I was given why it would be better if I looked at law and political economy via other forms of gambling than bingo. For a time, I renamed a large grant that I was running, looking at bingo regulation around the world, the Career Suicide Project. So it was honestly absolutely lovely, genuinely lovely to have the book recognized by the prize, and I'm just so grateful to the committee. So I've been asked to speak for about 20 minutes, about 17 now, introducing the book. So I'll do a quick overview of where it came from personally and intellectually. And then I'll try and identify a few analytic threads that might be relevant to an IPE audience, even if you're not interested in bingo. Though I find that strange to imagine. And then I'll end with a quick reflection on what I'm taking away from the fact that the book won this prize, given that it was a bit of a surprise to me, I have to say. So in terms of where the book came from, it's partly the product of having grown up around a lot of people who played bingo in Butlins, holiday parks and commercial bingo halls and British legions and seaside arcades, later gay bars, residential homes. And because of these experiences, I was aware of the game's distinctive atmosphere, environment and appeal. But academically, the book started in 2008 with a tiny pilot project on how a new piece of legislation in the UK, the 2005 Gambling Act, was affecting seaside bingo operators. And I was interested in that because most of the debate about the 2005 Gambling Act had been about casinos. And I wanted to know what else was going on. And then I did some research in Canada, funded by the Alberta Gambling Research Institute, looking at provincial bingo regulation. And then in 2014, I won a large ESRC grant to look at gambling regulation in England and Wales, Canada, Brazil, and the European Union. And that grant involved a team of wonderful academics, including Tony Williams, Donald Casey, and Louisa Jobeam at Kent. So Bingo Capitalism is my take on the England and Wales research part of that grant, but there are other publications out there from me and from other members of that grant team on other places that we looked at too. So intellectually, the starting point was that in 2008, partly inspired by the financial crisis, I got really interested in the relationship between gambling and capitalism. And that's a relationship that is foundational to IPE. So in terms of political economy, John Maynard Keynes wrote about gambling. My book's title is a riff on Susan Strange's book, Casino Capitalism. But in terms of popular culture as well, post-2008, we saw this resurgence of narratives where responsible profit-seeking and appropriate speculation were reasserting themselves and reasserting their legitimacy by distinguishing themselves yet again from gambling. And that distinction is as old as the stock market itself. And it's historically central to the ability of finance capital to reassert its power after a crisis. But I wanted to move beyond using gambling as a metaphor in political economy to think through what diverse commercial and non-commercial gambling practices and what their regulation could tell us about political economy. And I also wanted to spend time thinking about a gambling form that was very different to the male-dominated ones that tended to hog the limelight in even critical IPE conversations about gambling. So those are mostly about casinos and about poker. So according to recent industry statistics from the UK's gambling regulator, the Gambling Commission, licensed bingo premises outnumber casinos by 4 to 1. And that's not to mention the thousands of places where bingo is played without a need for a license or a permit. So church halls, British Legion clubs, working men's clubs, so on, where the gambling is undertaken for non-commercial purposes. So just to give you one example, in a really quite small part of South Wales, where I spent some time doing field work, officials of a federation of working men's clubs reported that there had been 400 working men's clubs that were affiliated to that regional branch in the 1980s, and most of them had offered bingo. So when I started fieldwork, the first time I visited in spring of 2014, there were 116 clubs left. Now that's obviously a story of decline from 400 clubs to 116 clubs. And I explain that decline in the book, especially through looking at Thatcher's assault on mutual aid and how it impacted the leisure activities of working men's clubs. But that's also a story about 116 clubs still operating in a relatively small area of South Wales, some of them running bingo games to support their activities several nights a week. So at the vernacular level, bingo continues. And I wanted to know what that could tell us really about political economy. So the book's got 3 parts with, I hope, interlinked methods. The first part looks at the legal and political history of bingo up until the 2005 Gambling Act. So that looks at the Hansard debates that Lisa mentioned, case law, legislation. But the rest of the book draws on these more socio-legal participatory methods to explore regulatory processes since the 2005 Act came into effect in 2007, up until just before the book was published, really. So I did interviews with over 100 people involved in bingo. I did a lot of fieldwork and participant observation in a wide range of bingo venues over many years to see how rules shaped play. And so the second part of the book uses those methods to look at the regulation of workers and players. So it's the people part of the book. And then the last part of the book looks at the regulation of products and premises and new technologies, including by looking at online bingo play, online gambling, and new technologies that are being proposed as solutions to address gambling harm. So I do try my absolute best in the book to show why we should think about bingo just in its own terms, in more serious ways in our conversations about political economy. It is both a commercial activity and a non-commercial activity. So it's the perfect case study for research into diverse gambling economies, I think. But for those of you who aren't that interested in bingo or even in gambling, and I do understand from others that some such strange people may exist, then you may be more interested in the sort of broader lessons for political economy. So I thought I'd highlight maybe a couple just to see if I can pull out some more relevant threads. So the first one is on diverse economies. So one of the key problems, I suggest, in the book with existing debates about law and political economy is that they're not very attentive to more than capitalist economies, a term that includes alternative and solidarity economies, cooperatives, gift exchange, mutual aid, time banking, volunteering, things like that. And I borrow the term more than capitalist economies from J.K. Gibson Graham, but I offer some adaptations. So I myself am a bit uneasy with some of the sometimes power blind celebration of plurality that is revealed in some work, not all work, but some work on diverse economies. And I think that points to a really productive tension, for me anyway, between diverse economies literatures and theories and critiques of capitalism as a more structured whole. And so when I was drafting this book, I had a post-it note that stuck on my computer of Bob Jessop's reminder that, quote, not everything that is individually possible is compossible. And he was talking about varieties of capitalism literature there, and he was talking about the differential capacity of the state to use soft power, force, and domination to impose particular patterns of dispossession, valorization, appropriation. And the fact that not all varieties can coexist in the same economic space sometimes drops out of celebratory accounts of local cooperatives. I wanted to avoid that. So I wanted to try and make mutual aid and more than capitalist gambling practices central to work on gambling and to political economy generally, but I didn't want to lapse into a power blind celebration of pluralism. And so I wanted to look at how those diverse economies could and couldn't exist alongside each other by examining the everyday rules that govern this interaction. So that meant that I quite stubbornly refused to strip working class mutual aid practices of their booze and gambling related dimensions. And I admit to taking a certain pleasure in puncturing some earnest left accounts of working men's club life. Accounts that tend to privilege the fraternal insurance for respectable funerals and sidestep the grease pig wrestling and the share impersonating and the bingo dabbing. But intellectually, there are some quite significant issues at stake, I think. So, for example, the book tries to rewrite our histories of risk and welfare and the relevance of gambling to those in the 20th and 21st century by highlighting the importance of mutual aid, not just to gambling law and policy, but to law and political economy more generally. So secondly, the book looks at the role of regulation in shaping that interaction between capitalist and more than capitalist economies. And as I've learned from some of the people who are here and whose work's been really influential for me, law and regulation have sometimes been minimized by political economy scholars. I've done that in my own work in the past. So the assumption has sometimes been that because law is political, it's mere instrument, and that it just provides a cloak for extra legal forms of power, and that the story therefore is about the extra legal forms of power. But I learned that inequality and power are internal, in fact, intrinsic to law. So law isn't a mere cloak for real relationships of power that happen somewhere else. As Sol Picciotto puts it, and many other people have argued too, the exercise of power takes specific legalized forms. And so in the book, I wanted to correct the tendency of some work on the everyday or diverse economy to minimize regulation by positing the vernacular as self-governing via norms, such that state law or regulation only ever appears as something that's external, to be resisted, or that deforms alternative forms of sociality. So instead, the book tries to look at the role of regulation in co-constituting those diverse economies. And so I'm looking in particular at work on really low levels of regulatory activity, like licensing and permit granting in that respect. I'll try and take some of that forward. And then finally, I drew on and I tried to advance feminist work, both on the complex meanings of consumption and on users as co-designers of technology. So that the lack of attention to gender in mainstream political economy, and sometimes in critical political economy too, is well known. It's ongoing. I pull out a couple of egregious examples in the book, but I'm sure if we went round this little Zoom chat, we could all have examples. But the animating feminist question for me in this book was the one that was posed by Hilary Charlesworth and Christine Chinkian in 2004. And they asked, what gendered patterns of life, work, and politics does regulation support? And so I looked at the regulatory environment in gambling through which gendered subjectivities and gendered patterns of distribution were partly constituted. And of course, the 2005 Gambling Act doesn't have any expressly articulated gender concerns. It doesn't directly address gender inequality. The legislation, regulations, guidance, the standards, they all seem gender neutral, right? So the challenge is to try and explicate the gendered patterns of life and work and politics that the rules produce, that the rules sustain, that the rules alter and sometimes contest. And so in the book, I try and talk about how those rules redirect resources in gendered ways, how they remake boundaries between mutual aid and charity and commerce in gendered ways, how they devalue certain forms of class and gendered labor, and how they interact and clash with other rule orders. So the book is pluralist in that sense of looking at different rule orders. And so just to give you one concrete example, in one chapter, I focus on the role of membership in building alternative non-capitalist forms of collective being. So there's a lot of literature in political economy and in citizenship studies that distinguishes between members and consumers. And some of it assumes that the member is distinct from his capitalist other, the passive, normally feminized consumer. And so in that chapter on membership, I try to look empirically at the way that membership is or isn't activated in bingo halls, bingo spaces. So it looks at the blurred boundaries between membership and consumption, the gendered boundaries, and at how the membership and consumption are co-constituted. So in commercial bingo, for example, it looks at a really distinctive sense of membership in commercial bingo halls where regular players act like they own the place and are treated as if they own the place. So membership becomes an ownership claim in a commercial space. But then in non-commercial bingo, I also look at this really fascinating set of rules. I think it's fascinating. Anyway, it might bore everyone else. I thought they were fascinating. But this fascinating set of rules on whether strangers can play for large accumulating jackpots called snowballs. So can strangers play for snowballs? And there are club membership practices that try to stop people playing for snowballs, and they refuse to yield to state membership rules on selling tickets to anyone present. And that refusing to yield has helped sustain mutual aid traditions. And that refusal is both gendered and classed resistant. So that chapter is partly about troubling the valorization of the membership form in political economy. And we see that valorization in socialist leisure studies. We see it in Robert Putnam's much more communitarian celebration of bowling alone. We see it in some really avowedly anti-capitalist work in critical internet studies, and we see it in much more liberal work like Lawrence Lessig's work. So it really is quite embedded in how we understand the distinction between membership and consumption. And looking at bingo, I'm trying to trouble that faith in the transformative potentials of membership, and I'm doing that. I try to do that by adding a feminist component to that analysis. So in terms of what's left for what I was thinking of when I heard that the book had won the prize, the book has other arguments too, and one of them's about the challenge of asserting the academic significance of self-effacing and self-deprecating people and practices. So how do we do that? And I suggest in the book that bingo gives us a privileged vantage point on diverse economies and the role of the state in shaping them, precisely because it's populated by people who insist they're nothing special. So when I heard about the prize, I was prompted to think about how we grapple collectively and intellectually with self-deprecation and its role in the stories that we're telling about ourselves and our subfields. So my book on bingo was published by OUP. It won a prize in socio-legal studies, and then it won this prize in political economy. And I talk about failure a lot when I talk about my job. I talk about grant failures. I had one just last week. I talk about the struggle to get the work taken seriously on bingo and the fact that it was the career suicide project and so on. But when you win a prize for it, then I think you also have to take the opportunity to diagnose the structural factors explaining the success. And so I'll just take maybe a minute or so to just end on that. So I had collective support, including from some of the people here. But the infrastructural support side is a bit harder to articulate. So in the book, I draw a lot on the work of Jeffrey Boker and Susan Lee Starr, who did an absolutely brilliant book on infrastructure several years ago. And they say that infrastructure often becomes visible only in its breakdown. So I was the first person in my family to go to university. My access to university relied on a decent school on a council estate and free access to higher education. My later degrees in the US were reliant on scholarships that were open to foreigners and affordable visas. When I started my first permanent job in Kent, I had adequate research time and little amounts of internal funding to use for those pilots. I could pull together some grant applications with the proactive support of more senior colleagues who weren't burnt out. And there was grant money available to help fund some funky projects. I could delay my book proposal for Bingo Capitalism for 18 months until I was sure that I had quite a strong empirical and conceptual case for bingo's broader significance, both to socio-legal studies and to political economy, because I worked in a place where senior colleagues stood up for research and where they stood in front of junior colleagues to shield them from the worst impulses of some top-level university managers. I know that if I had been measured short-term on what gambling businesses wanted from academics, I'd probably have been sacked. Or I'd at least have been moved off of an academic contract that gave me any time for research, and that, of course, would have harmed my teaching as well. So the book was institutionally enabled by infrastructures that are breaking down all around us, at least in the UK. And I think, given that this is a political economy gathering, I think I needed to reflect on what happens when you win a prize for something that you kept saying you weren't sure was going to be taken seriously. But now that you've won a prize for it, you want the right things to be taken seriously as underpinning any success in the book, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you for adding those personal reflections at the end. They're really useful. I want to turn now to Donatella, who is going to offer her insights into the book.
Thank you very much, Juanita, and thank you, Lisa, for the invitation to share my thoughts on Kate's book. And thanks, Kate, for that incredible talk. How does one attempt to respond or to comment on a book like Bingo Capitalism? When Juanita asked me, I actually wondered how I could make justice in 10 minutes to the work that has gone into generating this, and you will have just heard it, so courageous, multifaceted, rigorous, caring, and provocative book. And I simply had to accept that I was unable to do that, and all I could do was to try and think through some of the incredibly powerful insights that I got as a political economy curious legal scholar. So this is going to be a very limited and partial take on the book. But if, as a socio-legally curious political economist, Kate has made the case for taking law and regulation seriously, I want to reflect on how crucial this book is for conversations about law and political economy. And so the first point is about the political economic power of law and its relationship to capitalism that you were just mentioning. Although I'm oversimplifying what is a much richer debate, I think this relationship is often either downplayed by legal scholars, those of us who emphasize law's creative agency and world-making abilities, or, on the other side, it is surrendered to the prevalence of economic reason that finds law's logic in its deeper material structurings, where the mode of production and relations of production end up determining the forms the law takes. Of course, we know that this relationship is much more complex, one we have increasingly described in co-production terms, and you've alluded to that. But it is the following, the careful tracing of this instantiation, the instantiation of this complexity, that I think has perhaps received less attention. Now, what I think Kate has managed to do is to offer a way out of these single track approaches or methodologies to, law and political economy. So in relation to law's world-making qualities, you've shown how, in the case of gambling regulation, legal elite opinions and the legislation these opinions have to bring into existence did not, in fact, reflect reality. And this is why you say, in a quote, that we need to avoid any suggestion that legislation, we could say law, actually produces as reality its imagined project, end of quote. I think as critical legal or socio-legal scholars, we understand that. But what we have perhaps appreciated less is the need to interrogate our enthusiasm for what you call the pluralist ethics of ambiguity, which again you have alluded to. In other words, there are limits to what law and regulation can do in making the world otherwise. And you illustrate these limits in the case of online bingo, for example, where definitional pluralism, which was seen to harbor potential, did not result in the proliferation of social worlds, but actually enabled the corporate trampling of working class associational forms. So on the one hand, bingo capitalism allows us to appreciate the limits of law and legal imagination, of our own investment in it, as you said, but at the same time, it enables us to take seriously its political economic power. What it does brilliantly by being attentive, as you just said, to specific sites, people, and objects like machines, flasks, and cards and their entanglements, is to show that relations and modes of production do not determine law, but yet they are imbricated in arrangements of social forces that have to be managed, including through law, if they are to become productive of some forms of social ordering. Now, sometimes these orderings do not materialize, as in the story you tell about the resistance women articulate in commercial bingo, but at other times they do materialize. So by taking bingo as a lens for looking at the transformation of capitalism in the UK, we learn, among other things, how, and I quote, Thatcher did not just crush the miners' unions, she harmed the bingos as well. The harms were not equivalent, but they were connected parts of a more general shift away from mutual aid and the forms of politics and culture through which mutual aid had been sustained, end of quote, in which you then go on to argue Blair's embrace of the global took forward. The point here, for me at least, is that to understand this shift in UK capitalism, and more generally, how orderings take the forms they do, how the different parts connect together, we need to look closely at the arrangements of social forces of which law is part. And it is this entanglement that is of importance, that can give us, legal scholars and political economists, a better understanding of when, where, if, and how law actually matters. And it's not always the case. And so we can appreciate that bingo and mutual aid, rather than casinos and the stock market, as you just told us, were an integral part of the UK gambling regulation story. We can also see how crucial players, employees, managers, policemen turned inspectors, and their gender, class, and sexuality were to the making of these arrangements, displacing without dismissing the role that politicians, legislators, entrepreneurs, and coders of technologies also played. Indeed, it is these arrangements and the processes of socialization that trigger, that harbor the potential for modern capitalist forms of social life to emerge or reaffirm their existence. And it's here that I find another wonderful strength of bingo capitalism that I want to briefly touch on. There is absolutely no romanticism nor nostalgia at play. whether of working class solidarity and mutual aid, which can be sexist, of working class women who can be racist, of community relations, which are always already commodified. And all of this takes us in very different directions from the uncritical celebrations of community, as you were just talking about, including working class and women spaces. What we have instead is a powerful commitment to the potential inherent in these arrangements. We can see how occasionally they offer the possibility for opening up contradictions between groups' expectations and the legal forms under which they're managed. And I think the discussion of consumption in this context is really illuminating. We can see how consumption in commercial bingo venues is not only productive of surplus value or profits, but of resistance and enjoyment and reinvention. In other words, of more capitalist forms of life. So from a law and political economy point of view, I think there is so much to learn. I've certainly learned a lot from Bingo Capitalism about the production and extraction of value, the differentiating and unifying qualities of capitalism, the continuum between material and immaterial labor, the class, gendered, racial, and sexual construction of skills, the role of the state, that of diverse economies, and much more. But I want to conclude with a question about law and political economy scholarship. The book has provoked me to think seriously about the praxis of tracing. It has made me realize how important both panoramic and forensic tracing are to theorizing economic and legal diversity, in addition to making visible what is often pushed out of sight. So I wonder if you could reflect a bit more on whether and how this theorizing can contribute to struggles to support and enable more than capitalist forms of life. In other words, without taking law too seriously, but also avoiding not taking it seriously enough. I wonder if you think there is any value in scholarship that seeks to co-produce with other social forces that make up these assemblages, institutional and other kinds of arrangements aimed at facilitating the proliferation of diverse economies and legalities. Or whether you, in fact, think that that is in itself a self-aggrandizing or actually relevant move by academics, as perhaps your participants would say. Feel free, of course, not to engage with this question, as you have taken great care, and your work always does, to avoid making sweeping claims like this one. So I want to conclude by thanking you for a book that has provoked me not only to think differently about law and political economy, but also to think seriously about writing differently. And if you have not read Bingo Capitalism yet, sorry, here it is. Just reading the introduction and conclusions from which Kate was reading will give you a sense of how powerful and analytically significant that different writing and researching is. So I really leave it here now, and I thank you again, Kate, for writing this book and sharing it with us.